Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Tuesday, April 18th. And I hope you've had the opportunity to watch Dead Poets Society in its entirety. I know it was a bit of a longer film, and I like to show this film in the context of our discussion of poetry, which is our last unit, but also just in the context of a film class. And as you can see in the notes below in the first section, that one of the ways this film is unusual is that a book was adapted from the screenplay. It's usually the other way around. And the film is set in 1959 and 1960. That part is important. Even though the film came out in 1989, it's reflecting the world in 1959 and 1960 and some uncomfortable truths about the world in 1959 and 1960. So, the idea, the way that women are objectified and presented as possession, the idea of cultural appropriation with Nuwanda. Those are just some of the criticism. It's a very Caucasian film as well. But if you think about what a prep school would have been like, a boys' prep school would have been like in 1959 and 1960, I think they nailed it. They nailed that idea of affluence and privilege, and also, I think they were able to utilize Robin Williams' talents. Many people don't know that he attended Juilliard and was Shakespearean trained. And I think you can see that in many of the scenes in Dead Poets Society. In fact, he ad libbed many of the scenes, and the scenes in which he was teaching, and the responses from the other actors who played the students were genuine. He was really amusing them, and they were able to film that and to be able to include it in the film. Obviously, the film might be best known for its expression of carpe diem. Seize the day, live in the moment. But the message is a little bit more complex than that because, after all, as Robin Williams says, or in the guise of John Keating, and this is a nod to the famous romantic poet John Keats, and that's why he's named John Keating, where he talks about that it's important to be an individual, but also to keep one's head about them and not to do something that is detrimental. And I think that is foreshadowed in the idea of the phone call from God, where Robin Williams talks a little bit, again, John Keating talks a little bit about how foolish it was for the boys to put themselves in such a vulnerable position that could result in expulsion. But before he leaves, he says, now, if that had been a collect phone call from God, now that would have been daring. And I'm not quite sure you understand what a collect phone call was during this time period, even in 1989, when basically there were still payphones. And even if there weren't payphones, the idea is that you would charge usually by the call. So that if it turns out that you wanted to make a call and you didn't have the financial resources to do so, you could call an operator and have the operator call the party you wanted to talk to. The operator would ask if that individual would accept the charges. And if they said yes, that would be a collect call. Hence the humor in Mr. Keating's joke. If this had been a collect call from God, well, that would have been funny. Obviously, the drunken party that we see, and the way again that women are treated in this party is very problematic. But I can't help but think about its message in terms of poetry. And it's one of the ways that I wanted to emphasize, which I've got in the second section, that there really is no clear definition to poetry. It's certainly not Pritchard's definition of poetry in Dead Poets Society. Poetry will oftentimes utilize particular elements like rhyme, where the endings of the words sound the same, meter, where you've got a particular beat, or alliteration, where the beginnings of the words sound the same. It doesn't necessarily have to. expect poetry to be shorter than what we've seen in drama and even in short story, but it will be more challenging because it is dense and it is compact. One of the things we talk about in terms of examining poetry is explicating a poem, which sounds like the word explain. And explicating means going through a particular piece of writing line by line, word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, to try to determine anything and everything that is important. Certainly, you could do this with any piece of literature, but it's obviously exhausting and time consuming to do that with something like a novel. But to do that with something like a poem, particularly a shorter poem, there are epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey that are as long as novels, but those are the exception rather than the rule. So, in theory, you should have a 4-line poem that you could write a 4 or 5-page paper about if it's got depth and complexity. Not everything has depth and complexity to it. We've talked about this throughout the semester when we've talked about formulaic fiction and the contrast between that and what we've been talking about in terms of literature. And just because something rhymes or just because it has a particular stylistic form, that doesn't necessarily make it worthy of study. So you can take a very simple poem like roses are red and violets are blue and sugar's sweet and so are you. You've got rhyme, but it really doesn't say a whole lot. And think about Bottom's speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where we're supposed to see that this is an example of bad poetry, where he says, the raging rocks and shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from far, and make and mar the foolish fates. And not only is that nonsense, but at the ending of that, he says that was lofty. So he's complimenting himself on a piece of bad poetry. So that's not to say that poetry can't be simple. Again, I think about Mr. Keating in Dead Poets Society, where he asks his students to write a poem, and one of his students, one of the more smart alecky students, says the cat sat on the mat. And Keating talks about how a poem can be very simple, but it shouldn't be ordinary. Yeah, and I would like you to consider that idea as we continue on with our poetry section. And maybe poetry is the most challenging of the genres. I suppose part of that is personal opinion, but it lends itself to multiple interpretations. And yes, I know we've said that with short story and with fiction, and I know we've said that with drama, but particularly with poetry. And I think one of the reasons why is because it tries to capture emotional states. And again, fiction tries to capture emotional states and drama tries to capture emotional states, but I think poetry is the genre that really tries to articulate feelings, trying to explain what love feels like, or hate, or envy, or grief. And there really are no words to really articulate what that feeling feels like, but I think poetry probably comes the closest. And there's some poets, I would argue poets like Emily Dickinson, who come very close indeed to being able to articulate these extremities of, or these extremes of emotional states. I'll never forget I had a professor in college to try to illustrate the difference between poetry or verse and prose or complete sentences. He basically drew 2 pieces of paper on the board, and on one of those pieces of paper, he drew lines that were supposed to represent words that went from one edge of the paper to the other, one margin to the other, and that's prose or complete sentences. When we write, where basically it's the paper or the screen that determines where a line ends and a new line begins. And then we make decisions about paragraphs, about dividing that based into topics. And then he drew a picture of poetry or verse, and it was a staggered line. Some lines are short, some lines are long, and it's not the margin that determines the ending of the line. It's the author that determines where a line ends and where a new line begins. And those are some of the questions we can ask ourselves when we are reading poetry, is where does a poem's line end and where does it begin? Because that was a deliberate choice that was made by the poet. And I've oftentimes likened poetry to music. And there is this oral element that's associated with poetry. I encourage you to read the poems minimum 3 times. I know that's something that I've been saying all semester long, but especially when it comes to poetry. So even though it's shorter and you might spend less time on it, you are going to need to spend more time on deciphering because it is so dense and it is so compact. And the first reading should just be to get a sense of the sound of the poem. I suggest you read it out loud so that you can hear the lyricism. And then the second reading is more so that you can determine not just what is happening, but why is it happening. And then the third reading ultimately to begin to analyze it somewhat. So the poetry is going to demand multiple readings, particularly a dense poem, because after your first reading, you are probably not going to understand what the poem says. So there's lots of different ways to address that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next class, where you can paraphrase the poem, try to put the poem in your own words, or what you could do instead is to explicate, as I had said earlier, the poem and go through it line by line and try to understand what each of those lines mean. And we'll talk about some examples of that next class. But going back to the idea of poetry and musicality, if you think about a song, a verse, we talk about verses in songs, and that's what poetry is, it's verse. And the reality is that a good song can be just as complex as a piece of poetry, a piece of good poetry, or it could be just as simplistic as a bad piece of poetry. So there are always the pop songs that appear every generation, the what I call ooh baby, ooh baby, ooh songs. They've got a nice beat, but they really don't say anything and they're pretty superficial. And then you've got other songs that have real depth and complexity. Now, I can tell you that I oftentimes have difficulty with listening to music because I'm not able to decipher the words and also appreciate the music. I don't know why. It's just something that I've never really been able to do. So I've got to focus on one or the other. Consequently, there are songs that I've been singing for decades that I don't know the words to, or in one way or another, I've mangled the words. And before we had access to Google, in my teenage years, we had to rely on things like liner notes in record albums, which meant that you actually had to purchase the song to get the accurate lyrics. So there's a whole generation out there that has the same difficulty I do in terms of knowing the true lyrics of a song. But I have particular challenges because when someone sings a lyric, they usually don't enunciate very well, so it becomes difficult for me to be able to separate the language from the actual beat. But imagine if we were to remove the singer and all of the accompanying instruments. Think about something like a drum. That basically all the drum does in a song is that it gives you a sense of the beat. And the language of the song should be reinforcing that same beat, but the drum makes it very clear. But imagine if you were to remove all of those elements and try to rely on the actual sound of the words themselves. And to illustrate this point, I have two versions of a rather famous song that you might have heard of before, The Sounds of Silence, initially done by Simon and Garfunkel in the late 60s, very much a folk ballad, and it is very introspective and it's very somber. And it's very reflective. And you can see in the notes below in the fourth section, I've got the or a live version of that song. What makes this live version so particularly impressive is that Simon and Garfunkel agreed to perform together because they had a rather bitter business breakup and refused to appear on stage together. But in this version that I am showing you from the 1990s, they agreed to be on stage together. And there is closed captioning, which I encourage you to put on so that you can read as they are singing. Unfortunately, the closed captioning does make a few mistakes, but after you watch this particular performance, I ask that you watch the cover. And this particular cover was done by Disturbed. And what's interesting about this cover is that Simon and Garfunkel not only like the cover, which is oftentimes unusual when someone does a cover of someone else's song, but they argue that it's just as good, if not better than, their original version. And in the Disturbed version, it's not a live concert. So, what you're going to see is a music video that'll obviously influence how you approach those lyrics, or the way that you respond, I should say, to those lyrics. The Disturbed version is much more passionate and much more irate, much more angry. Um, and it's not that one is better than another, it's just they're different. And yes, you might like one more than another. I kind of liken it to ice cream. You might like vanilla ice cream more than you like chocolate ice cream, but that's not to say that chocolate ice cream is bad. Um, they both are great. It's just a question of personal preference. And I think you can think about that in terms of music, and also you can think about that in terms of poetry. And just like any super fan, if you were a super fan of a particular musician, say something like Taylor Swift, certainly you could appreciate her music for what it is, but a super fan would probably want to know about all of the musical influences that she had to help her develop her style. It's the same with poetry. You can appreciate a poem for what it is, but you can also look and see what the previous influences were on that poet. So, in the poetry section, I deliberately try to organize the poetry in chronological order so that you could get a sense of progression. Now, the poems that we're focusing on are British and American, and that's not to in any way disparage any of the poetry from other nations and other areas, but usually when we study literature, we focus on the British and the American tradition. And for our early poems, we can hear some of these poems being read by professional poetry readers, just like they're professional actors. There are professional poetry readers, and some are good and some are bad. And then as we progress a little bit further, we'll be able to hear some of the poetry read by the authors themselves as the technology advances so that they can record themselves. And just like a songwriter, some songwriters should be singing their own songs and some songwriters should not be singing their own songs, and they should just focus their attention on writing. Same with poets. Some poets can read their poetry and some really shouldn't be reading their poetry out loud. And then by the time we get to the ending of the poetry section, we'll also have video that can accompany a reading as well. So, that said, I wanted you to focus on the sounds of silence, and that in itself is poetic, that silence can make a sound, that it can grow like a cancer, as is illustrated in the lyrics, and the idea that people are kneeling to their neon gods is a poetic phrase. But I think the most poetic phrase might be that the words of the prophets are on the subway walls and tenement halls. And think about the power of that language. Now, some of the poems we will be reading over the course of the semester are not included in the latest edition of our textbook. So you can see this in the third section below, that I have listed them as handout poems. Obviously, I can't give you a physical handout, but I will be providing you with links. And thus far, I've been very fortunate and been able to find links for all of the poetry we'll be reading. I haven't necessarily been able to find links for the introductory material about what is poetry and how to read it and how to write about it. That is copyright protected from our textbook, but I will be giving you some background about that next class, much like we had background on what is fiction and what is literature and how do you read it and how do you write about it, and what is drama and how do you read about it and how do you write about it. We'll do the same thing with poetry next class. But I wanted to leave you with listening to both versions of those songs. And for our attendance question, to talk about paper number 2. If you remember, paper number 2 is going to basically be very similar to paper 1. The distinction being that this time you are talking about our drama section, whether you're talking about text or you're talking about performance. So that gives you multiple options here. You could talk about either the performance that we viewed in class in its entirety of Oedipus, or Midsummer, or Raisin. Or you could talk about, which means that you would be talking about things like camera angles and soundtracks and so forth, much like we were when we introduced the idea of Citizen Kane. Or you could focus on the actual text itself, the literature, which of course we know that there is an additional layer of interpretation because it's not just the author, it's directors and actors and lots of other individuals who help to bring this to stage. But there are two ways to approach this, where I'm asking you to either talk about canonical inclusion. Do you think that it should or should not be included in the canon, whether it's the text or the filmed version that we would have seen? Or contemporary relevance, which is oftentimes an element of canon, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the only element of canon. So you would just focus on contemporary relevance. And again, thinking about the idea that you don't want to lose control of the paper, so that it's less about our time period and more about the actual text itself and how that illustrates some contemporary relevance. So the attendance question for you will, what do you think you would write paper number 2 about and why? And certainly you can change your mind along the way. If you're not even sure at this point, you can say that you're not sure. You aren't wedded to your answer, so you could certainly change your mind. But this is the point in the semester where you should be thinking about paper number 2, which I will take up to the very last day of class. And our very last day of class will be our final examination. And we will be reading poetry up until the last day of class. So what that means is that there won't be time to write a paper about poetry, but there will be time to take a final exam. So the bulk of the final, 80 points of the final, will be devoted to poetry. It will be an essay exam, it will be an open book exam, and I will give you 24 hours to take that exam. If we were in a face-to-face situation, you'd have approximately 2 hours, which is about as long as you should be spending on the test. I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on it. And I will ask the sorts of questions that I've been asking for paper topics, questions that are less about facts and more about argumentation. Again, it's open book, open notes. So the best way really to study for this kind of examination is to have watched all of the videos, to have read all of the poetry, and to read all of the discussion forum responses about poetry, because you're just going to be synthesizing all of that information. And I will give you choice, and that will be the bulk of the examination. I'll ask you a couple questions, and you can choose from one. Then you've got 20 points left over, obviously, if you've got 80 points devoted to poetry. 10 points for short story, 10 points for drama. Same sort of idea, essay questions, but obviously much shorter. And again, open book, open notes. Again, the best way to study is to have read everything, watched all the videos. As you know, I put our past classes into our past class sessions folder, so you can review those as well as the discussion forum responses. And that basically should give you a nice review of what we've done over the course of the semester. And I don't expect anything that is well written or as polished as what you would do for a paper. You don't have 2 weeks. You have approximately 2 hours. So that said, you still should be able to put together an introduction, some sort of a body, and some sort of a conclusion, and mention some of the points that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And the last day of class is the very last day that I would take any assignments. So that would also include paper 2, though certainly you can hand in paper 2 at any point at this time. And also that also includes any revisions that you might have for paper number 1, because after the final exam our class is over and no late work will be accepted past that point. So we'll talk a little bit more about paper number 2 and the final exam as the semester progresses. But right now we are in the midst of poetry. And that will perhaps be evident to you when you listen to 2 versions of The Sounds of Silence. That should be about a 10-minute watch with both of these. So I'll leave you to do that, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.